Good morning, everyone. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Good morning. My name is Andrea Ricotta, and I'm here joined. Is this better? Right here? Right here? Okay. Just tell me like up or down with the microphone. Wonderful. Okay. So my name is Andrea Ricotta. I'm here from the Systems for Student Success office at the department, joined by my colleague, Becca Shor, who you all had the pleasure of meeting this morning. So welcome to MTSS 101 beginners session. Now we have this in air quotes. So I don't know all of you personally in the room. I've been able to say hi to a bunch of people, but I don't know everybody yet. But one thing I do know about everybody in this room is that there's definitely a little modesty in here because you all chose to come to the MTSS 101 beginner session. But we know that there's a lot of collective knowledge in this room and that people are not coming in here saying, I know nothing about multi-tiered systems of support. There's definitely a lot of great work that I'm sure you're already doing or that's already happening in your districts around MTSS. So, thank you for coming to our session, but we know you're a little modest. So we are certainly not standing up here as the experts around MTSS. Please come in with your questions and your thoughts, and we'll dive in together. So we're going to get into the session objectives in just a moment, but first we're going to make a quick switch on the title of the session. So I know you're in MTSS 101 for beginners, but we're actually going to change this to your Philosophy 101 undergrad course in college. So many of you probably took that course. I'm seeing some people laugh. May have been a great experience, may not have been, but we're going to just delve into that a little bit. And do a little think, pair, share before we get into our session objectives. So one of the objectives of our session today is to sort of get on the same page around what is the philosophy, what are some foundational understandings around a multi-tiered systems of support that we want everyone here in this room, everyone across Massachusetts, to understand. So really, a central philosophy around a multi-tiered system of support that we want folks to start thinking about is that when we think about students and we think about the systems in your schools and districts, the question that we're wrestling with is not what about a student or group of students that is causing performance discrepancies, right? But rather, what is it about the interactions of the curriculum, the instruction, the learners, the learning environment that should be altered so that all students can and will learn? So thinking about this switch of putting the onus on the student and rather putting the onus on the system and putting the onus on the adults in the system to make sure that each child has every opportunity that they need to be able to learn. So this might seem a little intuitive, like I see people shaking their heads, like, yeah, I'm with this idea, but sometimes in practice, it isn't always how schools or districts might be operating, right? It isn't always how we might be setting up so that every student can be successful. So I want you to take just 2 minutes to reflect on the 3 question prompts that are up here. One is, how does this underlying philosophy align with your district's approach of doing school? Do you feel like this philosophy around it's on the system to really support all students? Is that aligned with what your district is doing? What are some examples or ways that your district has really embraced this idea, that you're walking the walk and you're doing this every day in your districts? And then maybe what are some of the ways that your districts have some work to do on this front, some barriers to really aligning with this philosophy? So think for a few moments and then turn to a partner and share. Take about 2 minutes to share.
always feels a little bit, every year I'm working with the same people, I'm working with the same kids over and over, and I don't know if that feels right. Like it's always the same kids that are being identified. I think everyone's starting to recognize that there should be kids in the classroom and there should be strength there, but it's like trying to get how to do that. I don't know, like I don't know how to make sure.
So I'd love to just take a quick moment and get a few share outs from folks. Anyone want to share with the group what you discussed? Anyways, yes. Put your hand over here. I'm just going to be the runner with the mic.
I think philosophically that we believe that we're doing RTI in that manner, but I think what we're really doing, and I think RTI lends itself, if you're using an RTI model like many people are, that it lends itself to looking at where the student fits first and then looking at the systems and the structures after. So it's sort of flipped around a little bit. But I think if you ask people if our philosophy was supporting students, they would say that they were doing that, not realizing that we've got it flipped, I think.
Great, that's a really interesting point. Like, you might be hard pressed to find a district that's like, no, we are not for supporting all students, right? That is not what we are here for. But what are those systems that are really allowing that to be able to happen? And I'm glad you brought up RTI. That's something we're going to be talking about in this session as well, is sort of what are some of the similarities and differences between RTI and MTSS. Right here? Okay.
Our school implemented restorative practices 2 years ago, and so just working through sort of like trying to shift mindsets around like, what's happening for students, what's happening within a system, and then how do we remove a barrier, how do we, identify, what's happening for a kid as opposed to like these are problem kids is a shift that's been happening in the school. But I think the challenge that we have right now is that there's a lot of people all over the map with that still. There's not really like a common language and a common understanding. So we're working towards that, but I think that that's the shift that we're still working on, is like getting everyone on the same page about, okay, this is what we're doing here.
That's a great example. Thank you. Yeah, it's very challenging to get a cohesive mindset around this and change practice, right, at the end of the day, change people's practice. Anyone else want to share reflections?
Maybe an example. Yeah. You've seen an example that you thought was really strong of ways that systems shifted for students.
Again,
over in the beginner session because we want to hear more examples.
I said this is the modest group, right? This is the modest group. You don't have to be. You don't have to be. Okay.
Made you run, sorry. So we are from Dudley Charlton, and we may sound like we're behind the times when we say this, but we have just recently implemented and reallocated resources to be able to do the co-teaching model. And we've had to kind of break down from the term of, well, this is a new initiative, and we're trying to eliminate even that language to say, no, this is a best practice for students, and this is ongoing, and it's not just this initiative that's going to come and go.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's definitely a message that you'll hear us say throughout the sessions over the next 2 days is MTSS is not about a new initiative. We like to say this is just school. Like this is how a really good school should operate. But shifting that mindset, this isn't just the next thing that's going to come into your school or into your district. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Becca to start getting us into our objectives for today.
Yeah, and I thought maybe I would just share one example from my own experience. So I'm a social worker, and in a life previous, I worked at a teen parenting program that was located at a high school. So this is like an example where people were walking the walk and still had some work to do, right? So on the one hand, it was fantastic that they had this teen parenting program. They had, the school had a significant number of students who had children, and so they created a child care center at the school that not only those kids were bringing their children to, but actually teachers were bringing their kids to as well, which was such a fun thing to see in the morning, like teachers and kids both bringing their children together and like bonding over their parenting. And it also had some support and wraparound services for those teen moms. So that was all great. I think that was a great example of systems shifting to meet young parents' needs who want to be in school and wanted to receive their high school diploma. Now, on the other hand, they had some pretty strict policies around attendance, as one example. And you know, if you have a child, you know that kids get sick, and they get sick a lot, and particularly at certain ages. And sometimes, you know, there are emergencies. You have to take them to the doctor. We had some moms who had to go to the hospital at various points, and then understandably, were either late to school or had to miss school, and were ready and prepared to make up that work. But because they were not in school, their attendance rate dropped, and they were often in jeopardy of not passing their courses, right? So that's like an example of like where policies come rubbing up against reality. We have these students who are amazing, like dedicated students. I mean, I can't even really imagine what it must be like to try to be parenting and going through high school at the same time, and they were dedicated to it. But policies within our school district were potentially threatening their ability to graduate. So that may just be one example. By the way, if you couldn't tell already, Andrea and I are super casual. So if you have questions or comments or you want to add something at any point, please feel free. You don't even have to raise your hand. You can just chime up. Yeah, go ahead.
So it sounds like, you know, in that particular situation as we talk about MTSS,
Yeah.
I would want to, like, the reason why I'm here is like to see, like we make a lot of technical changes, but I don't want to confuse them with the adaptive changes that have to go along. So it sounds like in your example, you made the technical changes, but without, you know, talking about how the culture of and the mindset of the educators in that particular building were going to change, which was going to ultimately impact policy.
Yeah.
That's where the work needs to be, you know, centered. Because I feel like a lot of times you make a technical change and you say, okay, job well done, everything's done, but without changing the mindset. And one of the mindset that has to change is the fact that we are responsible for all the kids in our building. And so you may have like very well established tier 2 and tier 3 practices, but without going back and focusing on that tier 1, which should be robust, that will impact which students actually really need the tier 2 and tier 3. So I think that has to, along with the technical change of putting the systems in place, but I think we have to have an adaptive change to change the mindset and the culture.
100%. Thank you so much. That was a beautiful point. And I didn't elaborate on this, but yes, we saw that a lot, right? We had some teachers who really understood sort of the dynamics happening for some of these teen students, or students who are parents. And then others were like, look, they weren't in my English class. I have to fail them, you know? So it's not just about, as you mentioned, making those technical changes, but like how do we shift mindsets for everybody in the building to like have that common goal of what is it that we want for kids, and just take stock and like relook at some of our practices that might seem completely logical, that we've been doing for a long time, but might actually be creating unnecessary barriers for kids to be successful. Thank you for that point. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm from Waltham, and one of the things that I've run across is many of my students are thinking about absences for various reasons, but is the term flexibility.
Yeah.
And talking to teachers, I'm a special ed teacher, and talking to general ed teachers about being more flexible, but how can students make up that work? Because even though it wasn't a doctor's note, not excused, there's these other things going on in their lives. And I've been like really happily surprised at how flexible many of our teachers have been able to be for students. So when I think about this work, I think about flexibility in mindset as being a really huge component.
Absolutely. And that's really why it's the first tenet that we talked about this morning, and we'll talk about later in this session. That before you talk about any of the supports or the interventions or the data, it's the mindset around that all kids can be successful if we provide the right supports and figure out the right flexibility to allow that to happen. So I'm going to keep us moving here and just quickly go over our objectives for today. So on a fundamental level, we just wanted to unpack some of the underlying philosophies behind this model and some of the components, specifically some of the components that we've outlined in the MTSS Blueprint and framework. We're also going to take some time to unpack what that really looks like and think through some of those implications through a district case study that you'll explore as teams at your tables. And then finally, we really wanted to close with covering some misconceptions. I often find that the best way to describe what something is to describe what it's not. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions sometimes as it relates to MTSS, so we thought we'd just go over those together as a group. So this is the new MTSS model. Hopefully you all, if you hadn't seen it before, hopefully you received it in that email from Susan. And the blueprint, and you should have at least one copy of the blueprint on your tables that you can go through all the details and have it electronically. But I just wanted to feature a couple different components, right? So one big change that you'll notice in this new blueprint is that traditionally, you usually see like academics and behavior, right? And they're on two sides of the triangle, and they're sort of pitted against each other. And it's often sort of viewed as like, we just need to get kids to behave in order for them to do the academics, right? Seen this? Yeah? And of course, what research has shown us, particularly in the last decade or so, is that we need to be thinking about academics, behavior, and social emotional learning and how they're all mutually reinforcing and like sort of indistinguishable from each other. And if our goal is to not just impart content knowledge with kids, but to prepare them to be college and career ready, we know that social emotional skills are a huge component of a child's ability to be a successful adult. So rather than having two sides of a triangle, we're really thinking about those three dimensions altogether. And we've listed those three here, but I should also mention that in some districts and contexts, they might expand this to include some other dimensions, right? Sometimes it's related to physical health or social services. You have to like take a look, at the very minimum, we want to make sure that everybody's thinking about this, but in a lot of contexts it makes sense to also think about tiered supports on other dimensions, which all of these principles and all the systems can be applied to those as well. We also wanted to highlight two core philosophies. One is around universal design for learning. You'll have more opportunities to learn more about that, but we're thinking about how do we give kids the flexibility to have multiple means of engaging in the content, representing what they're learning, and expressing that. And we're not just thinking about that at tier 1, but all of the interventions, are they being universally designed so that kids can access them in ways that feel relevant and engaging to them? I'm also just thinking about Urban's example from this morning, right, in terms of how he was able to represent what he was learning in football, because that was what was meaningful for him. So we're thinking about that universal design piece. And then also, we really wanted to put forward the equitable access dimension of MTSS, especially in a state like ours, where we know we're often applauded for doing so well across the nation in terms of performance, but we also know that we have some of the most glaring opportunity gaps for kids. And so if this is a model that we're thinking about in Massachusetts, it should be everywhere, but particularly here, we want to put that front forward and make sure that we're not just thinking about aggregate performance, but we're thinking about those charts and what elevators we need to climb down in order to address those inequities. And then finally, we have 3 sets of systems drivers, right? So all of that center work is all well and good, but what are the systems that need to go into place in order for that work to happen? And we've categorized that into 3 different buckets. So we have the leadership drivers, right? And those are the things related to like, what are your means for shared collaboration? What are your means for stakeholder engagement? And like, how are we thinking about allocating resources as it relates to those things? The second set is around the competency drivers. So how do we not only train, but like recruit staff, support staff, and evaluate staff in a way that's in keeping with what we want to have happen at the center of this circle? And then finally, the implementation drivers relate to what types of evidence-based practices are we using, what types of data are we looking at, all of that kind of stuff. And then of course, you know, no MTSS model would be complete without a triangle, but in this case, we've turned it into a cute little school. So that's still at the center of the model. So just wanted to go through the drivers in a little bit more detail, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. And if later you engage in the MTSS self-assessment, it's really based on these systems drivers. Because we can't, you know, a lot of times people will want to just go straight to mapping out what interventions they have at each tier, right? And then that's sort of their MTSS model. But all of that's well and good, but if those other 3 sets of drivers aren't in place, none of that can really get off the ground and none of it can be sustained. So that's where we're really trying to help put the emphasis. This is sort of a permutation on implementation science, by the way, for anybody who's sort of edgy-wonky and enjoys their implementation science work. And we just sort of adapted it for our context. And you know, as we talk about systems work, sometimes that feels like so jargony, right? Like, yeah, we know we need to make systemic change, but like, what does that really mean? And what does that really look like? And Andrea and I were trying to think through, like, what's an example of systems change in another part of our life that just changed the way that we operate, changed the processes, the norms, the structures. And so this is a drive-through of the drivers, right? So we were thinking about driving. And think back many, many years ago. And it used to be that roads were not paved, they were just dirt. And that caused a lot of accidents, it caused a lot of damage to the vehicles and things like that. And so people started to realize, you know what? We need to put in this tier 1 intervention for all cars that we're going to pave the roads. And that just really changed the whole system for everyone. Another example might be rotaries, which I guess we're like very well known for in Massachusetts, so we have more rotaries than other places. And normally, like, I kind of curse that because I'm like, oh, it's a rotary and it's a little nerve-wracking. But actually, there's a lot of research that says that rotaries are safer than, you know, what are you talking about, crosswalk, you know, like, right? Because the act of stopping and then going and waiting for people causes a lot of accidents. And so in a lot of places, they have put in rotaries because they've actually found that is a lot safer for everyone. So again, that's totally changing the way that we all drive. It's a tier 1 system that fundamentally changes the operation of driving. And then there might be like a tier 2 change, right? So I'm sure at one point, cars were just fixed as they were. You have the seat where it is. And it doesn't matter how tall you are or your size, you can't really move the seat around. And so your view of the road is going to be either optimized or really significantly diminished. So a tier 2 change might be the fact that now almost all cars have the ability to change the settings, the height of the seat, so that people can view the road in a way that suits their body type. And maybe a tier 3 setting, or tier 3 option might be just getting an Uber because you're a really bad driver. I don't know. So that's just like an example of when we're talking about systems changes in a different context. So this is all listed out for you, and I think I went through most of them already, but under leadership, oh, actually, I have this animated. So the systems drivers are leadership, competency, and implementation. And then underneath the systems drivers, we have 3 or 4 indicators. So for leadership, it's shared responsibility and collaboration. resource allocation, and then student, family, and community engagement. For competency, it's staff recruitment, selection, and onboarding, professional development and coaching, and then finally feedback and evaluation. And then for implementation, it's tiered continuum of evidence-based practices, implementation fidelity, database decision-making, and high-quality curriculum and instruction. You may frame it in a slightly different way in your own context, that's totally fine. It's just like a structure to help think about what are those major things that need to be in place. And then, we're not going to go into it in this session, but underneath each of those indicators, we provide some elements to help you think about what that would actually look like. And some of those are actually listed in the blueprint, and they're all in the self-assessment tool.
Okay, so we want to get you all into a little interactive activity for a good portion of the rest of the session. So Becca actually shared this slide during the opening plenary, so you should have seen this before. And if there's one thing that you're leaving this session with, it's really starting to wrap your mind around these 6 core, you could say tenets or philosophies behind MTSS. We started getting into this a little bit with our Think, Pair, Share at the beginning, but really helping to think about how do we as leaders get on board with all these tenets, get our staff on board, but not just saying like, yeah, we agree with this, right? Because again, I think a lot of people would say, yeah, I agree that all students are capable of learning, but are our schools and districts really set up to allow that to happen? So rather than sort of just talk about this in theory, we wanted to get into an example for you all to work through with folks at your table. You might be sitting with people that are that you came with today. You might be sitting with a different group of people, and that's totally fine. But what we want to spend about 20-25 minutes doing as a group is diving into a district case study that you all have at your table. So you can see there's a sort of a 2-page case study here of a district in Massachusetts. And you have a note catcher to go with that. So if you'll take a look here at your note catcher. These are also all available electronically through the tiny URL that is at the bottom of your agenda if folks would rather work on these electronically. So what we're going to ask you to do is read through the case study. You can mark it up, take it with you. And as you read through, I want you to think about these 6 tenets of MTSS and identify, where is this district aligning with these tenets? Where are their systems, where are their policies, where are their practices aligning with one of these tenets? And then where is some misalignment? Right? Where is this district maybe trying to do something, but it's actually not in service to one of these tenets? And so what I want folks to do is take I'll set a timer for about 4 minutes, 5 minutes or so, just to give people some reading time, individual reading time. When that time is up, I'll let you know. It doesn't mean you have to start talking. But start thinking about, where might I be seeing that there are examples that, this district isn't being as proactive as they should be around a certain area, or they're not really focused on prevention here. They're being a little bit more reactionary. And so start thinking about that. So I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes, give a little reading time. Then we'll come back together and start some table discussion on this. So folks should certainly feel free to keep reading, but just to avoid the people sitting around in awkward silence and not knowing when they can begin talking, you can begin working with your team. So for example, as I read through this, I thought about this district that is really focusing on engaging families, engaging community members. They're holding these evening meetings, right, to get input from stakeholders, talk about what they're doing. So that might be an area of alignment around stakeholder engagement. They're really trying to get input from families in the community. But then I thought about there may be some barriers to families being able to attend those meetings, community members being able to attend those meetings. Are there other ways that they could think about really authentically engaging folks in their community? So it's just one example of where you might see some alignment or misalignment to these tenets. So I'm going to turn it back over to you all. Feel free to start conversations at your table around some reactions to this district and their work around building a multi-tiered system of support.
Before I blew you away, there's a lot of stuff on the street.
Sorry, I'm just reading.
So, 5 months
I mean,
so yeah, they were
when I first got, when I was reading this was that
making it across the board okay as counselors.
it felt like they were
Sure,
urban
everybody's getting the
smart.
same message or,
Like it felt like they're
right,
it
what
felt
are
like
the
they're
needs?
just
Like, we need something, but if we
that
don't
am I
know
answering the question the right
then
way?
how are we supposed to meet that expectation?
So I guess the way I interpret it, I don't know if I even interpreted this process correctly, is that where were the areas that they were able to reach each of these things, where they were. So for me, when it says all students are capable of grade level learning with adequate support, it was the one that I didn't write in there, but I feel like because all hands are on deck, and we did get that feel wherever I read. I mean, they had guidance counselors coming in, going through lessons. They had teams meeting at common planning and tracking students. It didn't sound to me like it was like your class versus my class. So to me, that's like kind of all hands on deck. So I do think that they're reaching the students. And I did see some alignment there with them. Anybody else?
I actually went
Different? All right. I guess maybe I assumed they were picking standards topics. Maybe
figure it out
not.
now because otherwise they're figure out how to figure out I felt like they had,
That is true.
I feel like they have not all that advisory and like the attendance students that are on this, you know, ask for surveys, how not down.
I also found the out-of-district police are not like 5%. The police can also
Right, but on the contrary though, yes, there was low, but they're aligning. It says at the open house, it's teachers included increased visual representations of work, including PowerPoints they were handing out. So it's like, yes, it was low, but weren't they doing things to increase that
And whether it's short term, so that they can just go back and
Yeah, good point. Right, like where did they get that? Yeah, no, I hear that too.
I would say that's a lot also,
Maybe I was so focused on the positive because I feel like some of the things that are happening here are not even close to happening in our school. So for me, I feel like we are not having discussions about kids as a whole. Correct. And so we're not like. So our data meeting stops. First IST, there was IST. IST was a kind of a nightmare in a weird way because at least this is what the message is in my school. People were just like referring kids and they wanted them on class. So IST was serving the purpose of allowing, but at the same time it was allowing teachers to talk about kids and they lost the class. So IST, so I'm going back to years when IST was there when I first came. IST was like, I think they met like maybe twice, I don't even know, like twice a month or if you had to sign up to bring a kid, what I remember when I first started. And I think the teachers needed that platform to talk about a struggling student. Yet I think people in the special ed role, and again, I don't software wasn't learning. So, and then those stopped. So now I think about what happened in the course of the past 2 years is that we were just, me being like a math specialist, I was like an interventionist, and kids, there were conversations with kids. It was like, hey, this kid's struggling, you need to take this kid. Hey, reading, this kid can't read. Steve, you need to take this kid. That wasn't happening in the classroom. There was no communication. And I feel like that's where we are at right now in Kennedy right now. Where, and maybe that's why I was trying to, I was telling them positive because I was seeing things in here that they were doing as a team that I know we have done. And it said it was run, I thought one thing was weird, it was run by the superintendent. How does the superintendent trust students? Unless that superintendent was there to just make sure every other moving part, unless everybody had different roles, I was confused by that. Yeah, that was not clear. I do know I read a book this summer I had to read.
This is just a 2-minute warning that we'll come back together in 2 minutes to share some of your reactions. 2 minutes.
They've got a leadership team at their school. Well, I'm not talking about like content, like you've got, like I'm talking about MTSS. Like, there is no leadership team for MTSS, which is very separate than like a content specialist. Do you know what I mean? Because content specialists, I think we have, at least I know the elementary, but a leadership team and that was going to be it's like, have a leadership team that does something like they describe here, then you pull in what's happening with the students. It was called a drawing to school thing right now. I mean, it was a heavy reading, I'm not gonna lie, like I would read it and be like, oh my god, I got like 30,000 more pages to go. Yeah, it was a lot, but it was the part that I walked away from even after reading all of it was, it really got your mind thinking about how everything is kind of like, you know how we're so used to the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 model? Like when you look at that, I always saw like, they almost flipped it, they did it upside down, it really needs to begin at tier 1. We always had tier 3 at the bottom, so in this book, it had tier 3 at the top, and it was like, have as many tier 1 possible as though it's tier 3. I mean, you wouldn't have to have as many tier 2s if the tier 1 was allowed, was providing the supports. Because really was the gist of it. So that was part of the talking about how we need to like get these supports and things in tier 1 and that minimizes the school. That was kind of interesting.
So just try to wrap up the conversations you're having at your table. We're going to come back together for a few minutes. Thank you. So I know, thank you everyone. Just can't stop the talking.
It's so hard. I don't know.
So I know as I was walking around, I definitely heard people making a lot of connections to the case study. So we're going to spend a few minutes, not necessarily going through this note catcher and what did people write down for each of these specific tenants, but would love to know and hear a few reflections around, what about this resonated for you in your work in your district? Not necessarily, yes, we do that program, or yes, we have tried that, specific tactic, but what are you seeing here that you're making some connections with your work in your district, or some reflections you had in your group?
One part we talked about was where they mentioned the time constraints, where they had a system in place to check in with teachers and look at data about students, but then either had the time constraint of not getting to each student. We also connected that with not having the time constraint of touching base with teachers every 6 to 8 weeks or whatever in that cycle consistently throughout the year.
Great, thank you. So you might set up some systems in place, but then, right? Can you stick to them? Can you be consistent, right? Others? Yeah.
We'll follow up on that comment, because when we talked about if you have the systems in place and that your tier 2 and tier 3 students are being addressed, but then you don't have time, that really looks at kind of like an inverted triangle when your tier 2 and tier 3 students are being over-referred, and it becomes more of a caseload to take a look at the tier 2 and tier 3. So it's like, how are you creating your tier 1 and your referral systems? How are you analyzing your systems to make sure that tier 2 and tier 3 are being targeted and direct?
Great, thank you. And did anyone have any reactions to, there's a line in the case study around the student support person who said they have the right supports in place for their tier 2 and 3 students. Any reflections on that? I have here and then.
Again, I'm special ed, so I'm just like, you already labeled your students, and they're going to stay as tier 2, tier 3 forever. So what kind of intervention is that if you're not also, planning to, give them the support they need so they can do it themselves? What kinds of things are you doing?
So I'm going to relate this back to sort of key tenet number 1, all students capable of learning, and sort of flipping, again, this is a mindset shift, it might be a language shift around talking about students aren't tiers, but tiers are supports that we can provide to students, and sort of being deliberate about that, that flip in language. Other reactions, thoughts people had? We'll go here and then come back there.
Our table talked about the line about guidance counselors there seems like there are not enough guidance counselors, and we actually flipped that on its head and said, really, it shouldn't be the guidance counselor's responsibility to be doing this. It's got to be everybody's responsibility to be doing this work, and then it doesn't become there aren't enough guidance counselors. Throwing people at it is not the answer. That's what we found.
Great. Thank you. Sure, we'll have one more here and then a question. Yeah.
This district seems curiously detached from the reality of their data, but this is a very common thing. In fact, they say, we know who all our tier 2 and tier 3 students are and provide them with the interventions they need, and yet their scores are apparently going down consistently in ELA for the past 5 years. So yes, they're getting exactly what they need, they're getting awesome interventions, and their scores are going down. It's about as effective as their 11% response rate is in a district that prides themselves on their outreach to the community. So it's a common thing, we do it all the time. We take great pride in reaching all of our kids. But there is some proof in the pudding.
Sure, we were also just a question about the first philosophy, just thinking about how do you change the mindset of that adequate support not being more people, which is why when you had said that putting more people, how do you change the philosophy on the adequate support, being either the classroom teacher or whoever else might be.
Great, thank you. Anyone, we have a, yeah.
This may have been mentioned already, but we did a lot of talk about Tier 1 curriculum instruction and what appeared to be a lack of focus when we read this. And when we talked about all students are capable of grade level learning, that strong, high-quality Tier 1 curriculum almost forces the school system to raise the floor for all kids. And we had a question about that because it seemed to be left in the hands of teachers to be creating lots of materials. So we just had a question about that.
I think one of the things that is very similar, and that is they have a lot of good systems in place, they have a lot of good tools, but it's actually the reflection about how those tools are actually operating is backwards lacking. So they're using sort of what is the model of how we should be doing, but they're not really then getting in and being honest and reflecting about, well, what are we really doing, and what about me as the teacher, not what is it about the student? What do we as administrators need to do different, not what does the student need to do different?
Thank you for engaging in this activity. We tried to make it kind of realistic, right? This clearly wasn't a district doing an amazing hit the ball out of the park job, but it wasn't a district that wasn't attending to MTSS either. It's sort of in the middle of the road. And in some cases, kind of like how Irvin gave that example this morning, where he asked you to reflect, do you think it was like a good thing, I'm not sure, or a bad thing, what his teacher did when he was a ninth grade student? I think there are certain things in the case study that maybe sparked a little bit of debate, like, is that really the right approach or is it not? And so it's just, there's no one right or wrong answer, but just trying to like guide the thinking on analyzing where are those systems in place and doing some crosswalking with the principles of MTSS so that we're not just doing things, but we're like thinking about, is this in keeping with the philosophy that we just said that we're holding dear? So thank you for engaging in that activity. I feel like we could talk about so many dimensions, like, you know, was it the right Tier 1 approach to do advisory? But then the teachers could do whatever they want. Is that evidence-based? You know, there's like a million dimensions that we could have gone into, and I think every table kind of honed in on different areas. But hopefully that kind of brought to life and helped crosswalk some of the concepts with some of the practice that you see in your schools. So before, we just have like a couple more minutes left. And we started to talk about some of these things already, but we just really wanted to hit it home as we're all sort of ambassadors in this work now. And as we're going back to our schools and districts and we hear things, I want to be on the same page about what really MTSS is and what it's not, right? So I mentioned this morning, it's come up during this session as well. MTSS, contrary to its name, is not just about the interventions and supports. It's really about all of those integrated systems, and that's why we spend so much time on those drivers to think about what it takes to make that work happen. Similarly, it's not a thing, it's not a program, it's not a pre-referral system, it's not your trajectory to special education. It's a framework for how we do school. Whether you call it MTSS, whether you just call it school, whatever you call it, a lot of times we hear people say like, oh yeah, we started an MTSS program last year. Or we have we have a partner that comes in and does our MTSS. Right, you've heard that before, right? Or we have like the MTSS system so that we know which kids need an IEP. Have you all heard those things before? So we're really trying to hit home that it's the framework for how we do school better. Another point that we haven't explicitly talked about yet is that RTI and MTSS are often used interchangeably. And sometimes when people use the term RTI, they really are talking about MTSS, all of the components that we've discussed. But technically, it's not the same. And there is a difference both in the scope and the philosophy, right? So a lot of times RTI is more focused on those academic interventions and also a sort of the onus again is kind of on the student. Like the student fails at a certain level, and then so we increase or ratchet up the intensity of supports. Whereas MTSS is really thinking about the holistic needs of kids. It's thinking about the systems that need to make it happen. And we're thinking proactively about what kids need rather than having a challenge arise. You know, it's interesting because a lot of times schools are struggling around their social, emotional, mental health supports. It's an area that we all have a learning curve on. But this is one area where that we sometimes do a really good job of understanding how those tiers are really fluid, right? So like if a kid, for example, had a crisis, like perhaps they lost a parent very suddenly, you wouldn't say to that kid, well, we are going to start you in a social skills group and see if that works. And then if you are still struggling with the death of your mother, we will move you to one-on-one counseling. Like, no, that's intuitive to us. We know that doesn't work. We don't just ratchet up the tiers. We know what they need, and we give them that support when they need it. But sometimes we don't always do that in other areas, and so we're trying to think that through. Andrea talked about this point already, but we're really trying to move away from the language of tiering students and more thinking, we do it all the time, it comes out so easily, right? It's sort of shorthand. But rather than thinking about that, we're thinking about the tier 1, 2, and 3 interventions. Because I can't think of anybody who has unanimously tier anything needs. Like, I don't have tier 2 needs and everything. Some things I have tier 1 needs in, some things I have tier 3 needs in. It's all fluid. So we think about the tiers and the interventions as tiered and not for kids. And by the way, one other thing that we should mention too is that the tiered supports aren't always indicative that the child is behind. Sometimes you might need a more intensive support because they're so ahead that in order to accelerate growth, they're going to need something more individualized. So it's not always about a challenge area, it could be a strength area. And then finally, for my special educators in the room, a lot of times people think of tier 3 as being special education, and it's not. There are students who have IEPs that won't need tier 3 supports necessarily. There are students who are not on IEPs that will need tier 3 supports. We sometimes use a dental analogy around this, right? So if you think about 2 kids here, and I know we're almost short on time here. We have 2 kids. One, Mary, was born with a traditionally formed palate. Johnny was born with a cleft palate. You know, this is not an exact parallel, but like in this scenario, we might think of Mary as being a general education student and Johnny as being a student that might need an IEP. Now, do both Johnny and Mary need checkups? Yeah. Do they both need cleanings? Right. Just because Johnny has a cleft palate, we're not telling him, well, we're going to go straight to braces because you can't have those tier 1 supports. Similarly, Johnny might have perfectly straight teeth and never need braces, but Mary may have the type of mouth that I had when I was a kid and needed braces for years. So it's all very fluid and interchangeable. I know we're out of time here, but thank you so much for your time. I don't want to hold up the whole group, but we'll stay around here if anyone has questions or wants to add any additional reflections. We really appreciate your time.